There is a question that has been asked in one form or another by nearly every philosophical and spiritual tradition that has ever taken the nature of reality seriously enough to interrogate it rather than simply accept it. It is not a new question, despite how thoroughly modern pop culture has claimed it, and the specific cinematic image that gave the question its most viral modern form. The red pill and the blue pill. The human beings suspended in pods while their minds experience a simulated world. The moment of waking up to a reality that is harsher and stranger than the dream. Captured something that philosophers had been circling for over 2,000 years before a movie ever put it on screen. The question is this: how do you know that what you are experiencing right now is the full and accurate picture of what is actually real? Not, how do you know there isn't a conspiracy, or, how do you know the government isn't lying to you? Those are much smaller, more mundane versions of a question that, asked properly, is far more unsettling. The real question is more basic and more difficult to dismiss. How would you know from the inside of your own experience whether that experience is an accurate window onto reality or a closed system generating its own internally consistent but fundamentally incomplete picture of what is actually there? If something about that question is already nagging at you in a way you can't quite name, drop a comment below telling me what you think. Is reality exactly what it appears to be? Or is there a meaningful sense in which we might be missing something? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss where this series goes next. And if this is opening up a question you've never fully sat with before, share it with someone who would enjoy chewing on it with you. Plato gave the question its first truly rigorous treatment in the Allegory of the Cave, found in Book 7 of the Republic, written around 375 BCE. The setup is simple and has been retold so many times that it has become a kind of cultural shorthand, but it's worth walking through carefully because the details matter. Prisoners have been chained inside a cave since birth, facing a wall, unable to turn their heads. Behind them a fire burns, and between the fire and the prisoners people carry objects whose shadows are cast onto the wall the prisoners face. The prisoners, having known nothing else their entire lives, take the shadows to be the whole of reality. They give the shadows names. They debate which shadows move fastest. They build an entire intellectual life around interpreting flickers of light on stone, with no conception that what they are seeing is merely a projection of something more substantial happening behind them. Plato's point was not really about literal caves or literal shadows. He was making an argument about the relationship between sensory experience and genuine knowledge. The claim that what we perceive through our senses in ordinary life is itself a kind of shadow play, a flickering and imperfect representation of a deeper realm of unchanging perfect forms that our senses cannot directly access. The philosopher's task in Plato's framework was to be the prisoner who breaks free, turns around, sees the fire and the objects casting the shadows, and eventually climbs out of the cave entirely into the sunlight of true understanding. It's a strange, beautiful, deeply influential piece of philosophical writing, and it set the template that nearly every subsequent simulation-style argument has followed in some form. Ordinary experience is not the full picture, and there is a process, difficult, often unwelcome to those still inside the cave, by which a person can come to see more of what's actually there. Several centuries later, and in an entirely different cultural context, a constellation of religious movements grouped under the umbrella term Gnosticism developed a related but distinctly theological version of the same basic structure. Gnostic texts, many of which were lost for nearly 2,000 years until the 1945 discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt, describe a cosmology in which the physical material world was not created by the true transcendent God, but by a flawed, lesser being often called the demiurge. In this framework, material existence itself is the trap, not because some external force is actively imprisoning you within it, but because the very structure of physical reality, as these texts describe it, is designed in a way that obscures the deeper spiritual truth of a person's actual origin and nature. The Gnostic path to liberation was gnosis itself, direct, experiential knowledge of one's true spiritual nature, as opposed to mere belief or ritual observance. It's worth being precise here about what these Gnostic texts actually are and are not. They are genuine ancient religious documents, and the cosmology they describe is genuinely fascinating as a piece of intellectual and spiritual history. They were also considered heretical by the early Christian church that ultimately shaped mainstream Christian doctrine, and the texts themselves contain wildly varying and often contradictory accounts even among different Gnostic sects. There was no single unified Gnostic teaching so much as a loose family of related ideas. Treating Gnostic cosmology as a literal, accurate description of how reality actually works is a much bigger leap than treating it as a fascinating historical example of how seriously ancient thinkers grappled with the same basic intuition Plato had, that the world as it appears to us might not be the world as it actually is. René Descartes, writing in 1641, brought the question into a more rigorously logical and recognizably modern form in his Meditations on First Philosophy. Descartes asked his readers to imagine the most extreme version of doubt conceivable. What if an evil demon, supremely powerful and supremely deceptive, had dedicated all of its energy to creating a completely convincing illusion? Fake sensations, fake memories, a fake external world, designed specifically to deceive you about the nature of reality? Descartes wasn't seriously proposing that such a demon existed. He was using the thought experiment as a tool to find the one thing that could survive even that level of radical doubt, which led him to his famous conclusion, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Even if everything else about your experience could in principle be an illusion, the very fact that you are having an experience at all, that there is a you doing the doubting, is something Descartes argued could not itself be doubted away. This is the direct philosophical ancestor of the modern simulation hypothesis, and it's important to notice what Descartes was and wasn't doing. He wasn't claiming reality is fake. He was using an extreme hypothetical to test the limits of what can be known with certainty, a method, not a conclusion. That distinction between using the simulation idea as a tool for philosophical inquiry and asserting it as a literal description of how the universe actually works is exactly the distinction that gets lost in a lot of modern internet content on this topic, and it's a distinction worth holding on to as we move into how this idea re-emerged in the 21st century in explicitly scientific and technological form. The modern technologically framed version of the simulation hypothesis traces back most directly to a 2003 paper by Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom, then at Oxford University, titled, Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? Bostrom's argument is more careful and more limited in its claims than the popular discourse around it usually suggests, and it's worth walking through his actual reasoning rather than the simplified version that tends to circulate. Bostrom's argument is structured as a trilemma, meaning he proposes three possibilities and argues that at least one of them must be true, without claiming to know which one. The first possibility is that civilizations almost always go extinct before reaching the technological capability to run what he calls ancestor simulations, fully detailed simulations of conscious minds, run on sufficiently advanced computers that would be indistinguishable from base reality to the minds inside them. The second possibility is that advanced civilizations reach that technological capability, but choose, for whatever reason, not to run such simulations. The third possibility is that if neither of the first two is true, meaning civilizations do reach that capability and do choose to run such simulations, then the number of simulated conscious minds would vastly outnumber the number of real, non-simulated conscious minds, since a single advanced civilization could in principle run enormous numbers of simulations. If that third scenario holds, then statistically, any given conscious observer is far more likely to be one of the simulated minds than one of the original non-simulated ones. What Bostrom is actually arguing is not, we are definitely in a simulation. He's arguing something more modest and more philosophically careful. At least one of those three propositions is almost certainly true, and if it's the third one, then probabilistically, we likely are simulated. It's a conditional argument built on a chain of assumptions about the future of technology, the motivations of advanced civilizations, and the nature of consciousness itself, every one of which is genuinely contestable, and Bostrom himself has been explicit in subsequent interviews that he doesn't consider the simulation hypothesis to be confirmed or even necessarily more likely than not. He treats it as a serious philosophical possibility, deserving of consideration, not a settled conclusion. Elon Musk's public comments on the topic, most famously at a 2016 conference where he argued that the odds we are in base reality are 1 in billions, took Bostrom's probabilistic argument and presented it with considerably more rhetorical confidence than the underlying philosophy actually supports. Musk's argument leaned heavily on the trajectory of video game technology, pointing out that games have gone from simple pixels to photorealistic graphics in just a few decades, and extrapolating that trend forward to argue that sufficiently advanced civilizations would inevitably develop simulations indistinguishable from reality. It's a compelling rhetorical move, but it's worth noting that extrapolating a few decades of technological progress into a claim about the literal computational structure of the entire universe is a significant leap, and a number of physicists and philosophers have pushed back on exactly that leap. That pushback is worth taking seriously, because the honest version of this conversation includes the genuine scientific skepticism, not just the genuine scientific enthusiasm. Physicist Sabine Hossenfelder has argued that the simulation hypothesis, as commonly presented, isn't actually a scientific hypothesis at all in the meaningful sense, because it makes no testable predictions. There's no experiment you could run, even in principle, that would definitively confirm or rule it out, which places it closer to unfalsifiable metaphysical speculation than to physics. Other physicists have pointed out that Bostrom's argument assumes consciousness can be substrate independent, that a sufficiently detailed computer simulation of a brain would actually produce subjective experience, rather than merely modeling the external behavior of a brain without any inner experience occurring at all. And that assumption is itself one of the most contested open questions in the philosophy of mind, not a settled premise you can build an argument on top of. This is exactly the kind of distinction that gets flattened in a lot of online content about the matrix and simulation theory, and it's worth being precise about it here. There is a real, ongoing, legitimate debate among physicists and philosophers about whether consciousness could in principle be produced by a sufficiently complex simulation running on some kind of substrate somewhere. There is no legitimate scientific consensus that we are in fact currently living inside such a simulation. Those are two very different claims, and conflating them is where a lot of content on this topic goes wrong. Quantum mechanics gets invoked constantly in popular discussions of the simulation hypothesis, usually through reference to the observer effect, the experimentally well-established phenomenon in which the act of measuring certain quantum systems appears to influence the outcome of that measurement, most famously demonstrated in versions of the double-slit experiment. It's true that this is one of the strangest and most genuinely debated areas of physics, and serious physicists do disagree about how to interpret what's actually happening at the quantum level. The Copenhagen interpretation, the many worlds interpretation, pilot wave theory, and others all attempt to explain the same experimental results in fundamentally different ways, and there is no settled consensus on which interpretation is correct. What is not accurate, however, is the common popular claim that quantum mechanics has proven that consciousness creates reality, or that the observer effect demonstrates we're living in a rendered simulation that only generates detail when something is being observed, the way a video game only renders what's in the player's field of view. That specific framing is a significant overstatement of what the physics actually shows. The observer in quantum mechanics generally refers to any interaction with a measuring device or environment, not specifically conscious observation by a mind. A photon detector observes, in the relevant physical sense, just as well as a human eye does. The leap from measurement affects certain quantum outcomes to the universe is computer-generated and only renders what consciousness is looking at, is the kind of leap that sounds compelling in a video, but doesn't survive contact with an actual physicist's explanation of what the experiments demonstrate. What's genuinely true and genuinely fascinating without needing any exaggeration is that quantum mechanics has revealed reality to be far stranger and more counterintuitive than our everyday classical experience would suggest. Particles existing in superpositions, entanglement linking particles across distance in ways Einstein himself called spooky, the apparent role of measurement in determining outcomes. That strangeness is real. It does not need to be inflated into proof of a computer simulation to be worth your attention. The honest version of this conversation is sometimes the version that resists the urge to make every strange fact sound like confirmation of the most dramatic possible interpretation. So where does that leave the question this video opened with? Not with a verdict, and that's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The honest answer after walking through Plato, the Gnostics, Descartes, Bostrom, and the genuine physics, is that nobody, not the most credentialed physicist, not the most rigorous philosopher, not anyone, actually knows whether we are living in a simulation, a base reality, or something else entirely that none of these frameworks have even adequately named yet. That's not a disappointing answer. It's the accurate one, and there's something genuinely valuable in sitting with a question that doesn't resolve neatly, rather than reaching for the version of the answer that feels most satisfying to believe. What is true, and what doesn't require any exaggeration to be compelling, is that this question has occupied some of the most serious thinkers across every era of human civilization, for a reason. It isn't a fringe preoccupation invented by a 1999 movie or a Silicon Valley billionaire at a conference. It's one of the oldest and most persistent threads in the entire history of philosophy, because it points at something genuinely difficult about the structure of conscious experience itself. The simple, strange fact that you only ever have direct access to your own perceptions, never to some external perception-independent vantage point from which you could verify that your perceptions are giving you the full and accurate picture. That gap between experience and whatever lies behind experience is real, and it's worth taking seriously precisely because it can't be definitively closed, not because someone has secretly closed it and is hiding the answer from you. That last point matters because it's the place where this conversation most often goes wrong online. The leap from, "This is a genuinely unresolved philosophical question," to, "And therefore someone is actively concealing the answer from you, and your everyday life is a deliberately constructed prison," is not a leap the evidence supports. Plato's Cave, properly read, is an argument about the limits of unreflective sensory experience, not a claim that a specific group of beings is administering your captivity. The Gnostic texts are a fascinating piece of ancient religious history, not a verified account of cosmic architecture. Bostrom's trilemma is a careful, probabilistic argument with explicitly stated assumptions, not a confirmed discovery. Quantum mechanics is genuinely strange, but it has not been shown to prove that reality renders itself based on conscious attention. None of that makes the underlying question any less worth thinking about. If anything, treating it honestly, with its genuine uncertainty intact, its genuine thinkers represented accurately, its genuine limits acknowledged, makes it more interesting, not less. A question this old, asked independently by minds as different as a 4th century BCE Athenian philosopher, 2nd century Egyptian mystics, a 17th century French rationalist, and 21st century physicists and computer scientists, has earned the right to be taken seriously on its actual terms rather than flattened into a more dramatic story than the evidence supports. So here's where this leaves you watching this video, in whatever room or chair or train you happen to be in right now. The cave allegory's deepest implication isn't really about simulations or computers or demons at all. It's about the discipline of noticing the difference between what you've directly verified and what you've simply absorbed, because it was repeated to you with enough confidence and enough emotional intensity that it started to feel true. That discipline applies to claims about quantum consciousness and ancient aliens just as much as it applies to claims about politics, health, or anything else competing for your attention and your belief. The most useful version of waking up available to anyone is not a single dramatic moment of revelation. It's the slower, less cinematic habit of asking, every time something sounds compelling, what is the actual evidence for this, and what is just the confident tone in which it's being delivered? If this kind of honest unpacking of a big idea is something you want more of, subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Drop a comment with your own take. Do you think the simulation hypothesis deserves to be taken seriously as science? Or is it better understood as modern mythology dressed up in technical language? And if you know someone who loved the movie but has never actually sat with where this idea came from, send them this video. The real history is, if anything, stranger and more interesting than the version that gets passed around without it. There's a thread in this conversation that deserves more room than the closing of the previous block gave it. The question of why this particular idea, in its many historical forms, tends to attract such intense emotional investment from the people who encounter it. That's worth examining honestly too, because understanding the psychology of why simulation theory and waking up narratives feel so compelling is at least as interesting as the philosophy itself. There is a documented phenomenon, studied by researchers in clinical psychology, sometimes referred to informally as simulation theory psychosis, or discussed within the broader category of technology-themed delusions, in which individuals, often during periods of significant stress, sleep deprivation, substance use, or the early stages of a psychotic episode, become fixated on the idea that reality is a simulation in a way that moves beyond intellectual curiosity into genuine, distressing conviction. Psychiatrists who have written on this topic, including case studies published in psychiatric journals following the release of The Matrix in 1999, have noted that media depicting a hidden, realer reality behind ordinary experience can become incorporated into delusional content for people who are vulnerable to it, not because the movie or the philosophy caused the underlying condition, but because the content provides a ready-made narrative structure that delusions can attach themselves to. This is worth naming directly. Not to suggest that anyone watching this video is experiencing anything like that, but because it illustrates something important about why intellectual honesty on this topic actually matters in a practical, not just academic sense. Content that presents the simulation hypothesis, ancient mystical cosmologies and claims about hidden control systems as confirmed fact, rather than as the genuinely uncertain, contested ideas they are, makes it harder for anyone encountering those ideas during a vulnerable moment to find their way back to solid ground. The discipline of saying, here is what's genuinely known, here is what's genuinely debated, and here is what is not supported by evidence, isn't just an academic nicety. It's a basic form of care for the people on the other side of the screen, some of whom are watching during the best moments of their lives, and some of whom are watching during much harder ones. Plato himself, interestingly, seemed aware of a version of this risk. In the part of the cave allegory that gets quoted far less often than the dramatic escape into sunlight, he describes the freed prisoner's return to the cave to tell the others what he's seen. And the prisoner's reaction is not gratitude, but hostility, because the returning philosopher, his eyes still adjusted to bright daylight, stumbles around in the dark and seems less capable, not more, than the people who never left. Plato's point was about the difficulty of integrating new understanding and communicating it skillfully to people not yet ready for it. Not about a need to abandon ordinary relationships, withdraw from family and friends who don't get it, or treat everyday life and the people in it as somehow less real or less worthy of your full presence. That distinction matters enormously, because a lot of modern content built on cave allegory logic quietly encourages exactly the kind of isolation and superiority that Plato's own text is actually warning against. The genuinely useful version of questioning what's real is not a permanent state of suspicion toward consensus reality, your relationships, or your own ordinary experience. It's a tool you pick up deliberately for specific purposes, examining a claim, checking your own assumptions, staying intellectually honest, and then set back down so you can keep living an actual life with actual people in it. Descartes himself, after building his radical thought experiment about the evil demon, didn't go live in a cave doubting everything forever. He used the exercise to find solid ground and then got back to doing philosophy, science, and ordinary life, with that ground established underneath him. That's a good model for anyone who finds this kind of content genuinely interesting, which it deserves to be. Sit with the uncertainty. Enjoy the strangeness of the questions. Read the actual philosophers if you want to go deeper. Plato's Republic, Descartes' Meditations, Bostrom's original paper are all short, accessible, and far richer than any video summary, including this one. And hold on to the difference between a fascinating open question and a closed, confident answer that someone is trying to sell you. Whether that someone is a guru, a YouTube channel, or your own mind on a sleepless night reaching for a dramatic explanation because the boring, uncertain truth feels less satisfying. That's where this one actually ends. Thanks for thinking it through carefully enough to get this far.